the couches, being comfortable and processing their lunches. I don't know if you guys managed to get out to the teepee, but the teepee is all set up and there's fry bread in there, thanks to Curtis Cardinal, who's a local young man, and he's going to be cooking fry bread for us every day, Bannock. So if you want a piece, they're nice and warm and fresh in the teepee when you have a chance later. And he has a little company called Teepee Treats. So if you're ever looking for the best Bannock in town, you just call Curtis Cardinal, Teepee Treats. All right. I hope you guys had a good morning, a good start. I know it was some heaviness to start with, and I got to participate in Mirta's workshop, which was fun, get us kind of energized and thinking about what are we going to do for a popular theater piece with you guys. So excited about that. So just for this afternoon, we have a little bit of a shift of program, but not very much. I'm going to be kind of your host for this afternoon, but we do have 3 speakers to set us off before we go to workshops. And so I'll introduce those, and we have Cam Alexis, who's the Executive Director of Tribal Chiefs Ventures, who's here. He's going to come up and speak. Fascinating, and I'll give you his bio in a second. We also have Petra Schultz, and then we also have Phelim Kine. So we're going to get in a pretty interesting discussion, I think, this afternoon about the state of things, particularly when we're looking at drugs in our world, but also the bigger picture as well. And then what's going to happen after the 3 of them share is they're going to come up on stage here, and we're all going to have a bit of a conversation, more of a, getting into things, and even them asking questions to each other. So it'll be good to start. So without any further delays, I'm going to get us right into this. So I want to introduce you first to Cam Alexis, and Cam and I have a bit of an affinity in that we come from the same area. Cam was born in Marythorpe, Alberta, and raised in central Alberta. He's married with 2 sons, a daughter, and has 12 grandchildren. Cam has served on various communities in Alberta and BC for 23 years in the RCMP. And he's specialized in issues relating to Indigenous people, and he's worked in communities such as Turney Valley, Black Diamond, Stony Plain, Peace River, Edmonton, until he retired, and where he became the chief of the Alexis First Nation. And then during his tenure, former regional chief, Cam served at a national capacity, holding several national portfolios, including missing and murdered Indigenous women, justice, policing, environment, and natural resources. And currently, as I said, he's Executive Director of Tribal Chief Ventures. And Tribal Chiefs is comprised of 6 First Nations situated in eastern Alberta. And he's also serviced the North Peace Tribal Council as Chief Operating Officer. So I'm going to invite Cam up to share some of his perspectives with you on these issues. And then we will keep moving along. So come on up, Cam.
Let's step in the line of fire. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah.
Let me take this one over. Thanks.
I'm going to adjust this mic just a touch. First of all, I'm going to speak in my own language because we are talking about human rights. So I think it's very important that we speak in our language first, because that's what our elders will tell us. And if I don't do that, I'll be remiss of my spirituality and my culture. So with that, abostet taguchwa ishnishigabuan nahabana istuchumzabuan na tuchiga pajaptes the washdewan which tabu uchigets come to na maguchinen uchigapchin ukonsti agikirabu. That it's a twat pashigas nin wahana which tabu uchagets kawan ishnishigam taguchwa. Don't say Anin, okay, and Masi. In my language, which is the Stoney Nakota Sioux language, I greeted you all in the traditional lands of Treaty 6, which is shared by several nations. In the stateside, you would call them tribes, and the Métis nations of Alberta as well. So I greet you as brothers and sisters, because that's what we are in our culture. We are brothers and sisters. You are in the Treaty 6 traditional lands. And I also want to welcome brothers and sisters from Treaties 7 and 8. Treaty 7 being in southern Alberta and Treaty 8 being northern Alberta and British Columbia, and as well as the 15 Métis settlements within the province of Alberta. I want to welcome delegates that are from other parts of the country perhaps, or other countries. We welcome you to the beautiful lands here in Edmonton, Alberta. And I also want to thank Renee and her team for allowing us to participate and speak. These discussions are sometimes very painful, and sometimes people have difficulty speaking about it because you know, of the pain that potentially comes with it. I have about 15 minutes, so I'm going to try and go as quick as I can. And because, you know, these discussions can go on a long time, it all depends. And I got a host of things I want to touch on in a very short order. So with that, you know, when you talk about human rights, of course, we build some of our bases from the United Nations. The United Nations, of course, at one time was the League of Nations around 1947, right after the World War II. And we do, by large, abide by the United Nations rules, I guess, although we don't, it's not enforceable, but that's the premise that we work out of. And then, of course, the human rights, there's the provincial, then there's the federal side of things. And a lot of times, as a First Nations treaty person, because that's what I am, as a treaty person first, we abide by the federal laws, because when treaties were signed, Treaty 6, 7, 8, not limited to that, there's Treaties 1 to 11, but Treaty 6 for the purpose of discussion, you know, we signed with the Crown, then Crown of Canada, and to this day, that's the way it's supposed to be. However, a lot of people still don't know very little about treaty rights and treaties. Treaty is still alive, it's still a living document, a living discussion, living law, as you call it, with the elders. They'll tell you that. And what I mean by that is the treaty is still, a lot of it is still unfinished business, and people wonder, well, why is that? But there's a lot of reasons for it, of course, but we'll get into that maybe as well as we speak. And very quickly, we could touch on UNDRIP as well, the United Nations Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You know, that we have the Treaty 6 Grand Chief here, Willie Littlechild. We call him the United Nations Chief. Why? Because he spent over 35 years working on this document, for example. And there's others as well, such as Ron Lehman, and there's a host of others. But the United Nations Rights of Indigenous People, sadly, was not endorsed by, of course, the United States, but here in Canada, it wasn't endorsed by Canada. Then Prime Minister Harper refused to endorse it for over a decade, and then when he finally endorsed it, he said, we will support the aspirational document. So, I mean, what does he mean by aspirational document? You know, there's 43 articles in there that recognizes Indigenous peoples all across the globe and all across Canada. And we as chiefs, at that day, we had to, you know, lobby for the longest time to even get it recognized. It's now recognized by the Trudeau government here in Canada, but what it means, we're still not sure cohesively. I know what the people want, but what the government interprets as is a different matter. Here in the province of Alberta, the NDP has endorsed it as well. Again, what it's going to look like is another matter. And I'll quickly move to, we all know about the residential schools. We all had that pain of the residential schools. And I see the IRS team from throughout Alberta here, and I'm really glad they're here. And I want to acknowledge the Indian Residential School team of elders and caregivers, etc. They're here. So it's great to see that. But the residential school itself, definitely in our humble observations, was a human rights violation at its deepest core. Very painful time in our history. My grandmother spent 10 years in residential school at a place called St. Albert, just north of here. And at the age of 6, she was taken away from her parents. And she didn't get back to the community of Alexis till she was 16 years old. And how she came back to Alexis was because my grandfather, who's passed on now, married her. So thank goodness, saved her. And my oldest uncle and aunt, who are now deceased as well, did spend several years in residential school. And it was a very painful time. Even to this day, it still affects us one way or the other. And I'm going to be very blunt. Some people in my family, they have a hard time hugging each other. That space, very difficult. Whereas some of you, it comes natural. You hug everybody, and it's just part of your life. But in our family, even today, there's a space, and you just don't touch it, sadly. And that's just one of the things about the residential school era that I wanted to touch on. Now, real quick, as a police person, I spent a lot of time with a lot of First Nation communities. That was my job, and we did a lot of things in terms of trying to better the race relations as it relates to policing. We had elders, we set up elders committees so the police can sit with elders to work with communities. Even that was a difficult time, but we had that, we managed to get to that point. And I'm going to be blunt, there is still a lot of racism and discrimination in the world of policing and the world of, but we have worked a long and hard to get it to a point where it's better. I remember when I first started, we were called Native Special Constables. I mean, even that is a low-level form of, okay, you're down here, and the regular members are here, and the officers are over here, but you guys are over here, so you guys will just, be special constables. Okay. So we did that for a while, and that's how I started my career. But at the same time, I applied and went to Regina and got my full recognition as a regular person, a police person, just like anybody else. So we as well suffered innately to be recognized as full-fledged police officers, that we can do the job just like anybody else. And to this day, I can tell you there's a lot of Indigenous people in the RCMP that are high-ranking officers, and it's great to see that because now we are part of the decision-making processes, whereas before we weren't allowed to make the decisions, and that was, talking about the 70s and 80s. And but I want to touch also on the TRC. There was 94 recommendations on that TRC. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done there. As we fast track real quick here, there's a lot of issues that are going on across the province, across the country that still affect Indigenous people in this country. And, for example, human rights. When a decision is rendered that's relative to human rights issues, and as a First Nation person, what is the threshold of for example, police persons or even governments laying charges when it comes down to discrimination, human rights, racism? I've yet to see what the threshold is. I haven't seen it. So somebody comes to me and tells me, I'm going to be upfront. I'm not here to hurt anybody, but I've seen it, so I have to say it. If we're discriminated, we're called racist remarks. We go to the police and say, well, this is a racial comment. We'd like it investigated, but, oh, no, they didn't mean nothing about it. They're just letting off some steam. Don't worry about it, and it's written off. Okay, where's the threshold? I'm going to give you another quick example. You go to a local town here in beautiful Canada, the Munyaos, they're in a local bar blowing off steam, having a great time. They spill out the bar and with drinks, maybe a little scrap, whatever. Oh, they're just blowing off steam, don't worry about it. But if it's a native person on this side, oh, look at those drunken natives over there. They're just drunk, look at them. Same situation, different color. Okay, they're blowing off steam and they're drunken natives. Okay, what's going on here? Same situation. Okay. And that kind of stuff, ladies and gentlemen, still goes on in this country. As a former police person, as a former chief, we dealt with a lot of these issues. I'll give you a quick example again, real quick. A lot of First Nations in this country, not a lot, but a number of them well engaged with industry to try and get work for their people. And there's still a lot of discrimination and racism that goes on in the workplaces. And we were trying to work with a local company to try and get our people trained and get them to work. So we finally signed an impact benefit agreement to get training for our people, get people meaningful jobs at the height of face-to-face with your shareholders and all that kind of stuff. So when our people get to the work site, what happens? It didn't drill down to the subcontractors and contractors. So the first thing that came out of the mouth of the individual looking after the work site was, well, nobody told me we had to hire any Indians. Well, excuse me, so we had stopped everything right then and there, and we went back to, the 30th floor, whatever it is in Calgary, and had to meet with the oil company and said, whoa, what just happened here? We're trying to train our people, trying to work our people, and they're told nobody told us to hire any Indians. Ladies and gentlemen, that kind of stuff still goes on today, and I really hate to tell you that. But I'm telling you that because I've experienced it. I'm not giving you an opinion. I'm telling you from actual experience. Very quickly, then you got the issue of case laws. In this country, the Indigenous people have won many, many Supreme Court decisions. Many. But when it comes down to enforcing the Supreme Court decision, who does it? I'm not sure. Who marshals to make sure that this happens? I am not sure. It just doesn't happen. We win a lot of court cases at the Supreme Court, but okay, we won these court cases. It says we have to be compensated, accommodated, compensated, and all this other stuff, but nobody actually does anything. I haven't seen it. There's many things we can talk about. I know I only have so much time, and I don't want to take away from my other people that are going to speak here as well. But I was asked to come just to share some of my stories of what I've experienced as a police person, as a treaty person, but also as a former chief. So we had to do a lot of interventions, a lot of lobbying to speak for our people, and I've done that, and I'm very thankful for being allowed that opportunity. I touched on the Supreme Court decisions. We really need to examine that. Human rights cases, we need to examine that. Just recently, several years ago, Canada finally acknowledged that human rights is in play on First Nations by virtue of the Indian Act. So that's out there. Hate laws are out there, but actually who really enforces hate laws when it comes down to Indigenous people and others as well? I really need to see it. I still haven't seen it innately, although people will say, oh, we do it, it's out there, but show me. I still need to see what the threshold is. I wanted to drill down real quick as an Indigenous person, as a former politician, had a privilege to sit and debate a lot of things. And some things here, I think we as Indigenous people, we still need to be involved. We still need to be included. I touched on Supreme Court decision. There's a thing called consultation. We're supposed to be consulted on all matters relative to what goes on in this country. Because I touched on the treaty rights earlier. Treaty is still alive and well, it's an international law. But what really, and this goes on today too. Here in Canada, we talk about human rights, okay? We're supposed to be champions or hierarchy of human rights. Okay, so I had the opportunity to engage in federal politics, and I went to one small community. I won't mention the communities for the sake of respecting people, but I went to some communities in Alberta. And some of the comments that we got, for example, as Indigenous people running for public office is, what are you Indians doing? Why are you guys running? Why? But I remember one case where I was sitting in a huge debate where we were selling, and then of course I talk about Prime Minister Harper, and it's still going on with Prime Minister Trudeau. We're selling arms, military vehicles to Saudi Arabia. Okay, we just finished talking about we're supposed to be hierarchy of human rights, but yet we're selling military vehicles to Saudi Arabia. So I really didn't, had a bit of an issue with that, but anyways, that's the way it goes. But I'm gonna sit down here, but I'll just add one more piece, if I may. Some of the things that go on here in Canada too is, for example, I'll use child welfare, children in care. As a former regional chief for Alberta, I was representing the chiefs of Alberta by majority and lobbying and being an activist in a good way, of course, to represent our people in their plights and their situations. And I'll use the Cindy Blackstock Tribunal as an example. The AFN was the signatory to that. But that has to do with child welfare and children in care. That's another huge issue. I can tell you stories on that one too. But in this case, it was sad to see that the former Prime Minister, Mr. Harper, for a decade, refused to acknowledge the situation with child welfare in First Nation communities, Indigenous communities. It had to go to court, Supreme Court decision, and then had to go to a tribunal. Years and years later, decades later. And what we found, which Indigenous people, it's not new to them, but just putting out to the gallery and to the crowd, that we were being funded 20 to 30% less to do the same work as is going on right now here in the city of Edmonton or any place else. Our people had to do work with 20 to 30% less funding to do the same work, but yet we're doing the job. But the point is, it had to take a Supreme Court decision to say that's going on. We can go on with many other examples, but that's just a prime example of situations that overarch on human rights. So with that, I'm going to sit down, but I'm open to questions, and I'm really hoping, to get something out of this as well, not just a one-way dialogue. With that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Cam. What kind of stood out to me as you were talking is the piece about subcontractors, and I know that kind of sounds crazy, but I know we've had some people from our community recently experience that out in Lloydminster with Suncor, with Husky, where they were turned away as young Somali women wearing hijabs because Husky had hired them, but they hadn't translated the conditions of their hiring to the subcontractor, which resulted in them having a really horrible experience. So thank you for that, Cam. We'll bring you back up. I'm just gonna find. So next we have Petra Schultz. And Petra, I was just reading your bio and it kind of made my heart sink a little bit because with my son running around here. But Petra Schultz is a founding member of Mums Stop the Harm, a network of Canadian mothers and families whose loved ones have died due to substance abuse. Petra lost her 25-year-old son, Danny, to an accidental fentanyl overdose in 2014. She serves on Alberta's Opioid Emergency Response Commission and is a research partner on a mother's advocacy project with scientists from the Universities of Alberta, Calgary, and BC. Through the lessons learned from her personal experience and by sharing Danny's story, Petra has become an advocate for drug policy reform aimed at reducing the harm associated with substance abuse. I want to thank you so much, Petra, for coming up. I'll figure out how to press play. There it is.
Slideshow?
Oh, I see. I don't okay there.
I got to lower this a little, otherwise you can't hear me. Technical assistance? Thank you, and I hope you all read the text, my notes on the first slide, so I can move to the second one. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for those words, Cam. It was actually the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that helped me with my grief. It was here in Edmonton a month before my son died, and after he died, I had to think back to the survivors who were sharing, and I thought, they're living, they're standing, they're speaking, so can I. So to all the people who spoke, you gave me strength. We lost our youngest child, Danny, to an overdose in 2014. He was 25 years old. Through the lessons learned from losing Danny and by sharing his story, I've become an advocate for drug policy reform. What I've learned from our experience can be summarized in 8 lessons that I'd like to share today. Danny was in recovery when one more pill, which he thought was OxyContin, a fake OxyContin, but in fact turned out to be fentanyl, took his life. We did not know about the increased risk in recovery, and the person's tolerance is lowered, and their information about the drug scene is less fresh. He was one of the early victims of fentanyl before it made the news and before there were any health warnings. They came several months after his death. Since then, in 2014, many more have died, and in 2016, more than 600 people in Alberta died from overdoses caused by fentanyl and other substances. After Danny died, we decided to be open about the cause of death. We wanted to end the silence and the stigma. Friends and family and his workplace were surprised. Danny did not look like an addict, a word that I don't care for much. How does a person who struggles with substance use look like? In many cases, it is an invisible condition. And my first lesson is that overdose can affect anyone. When Danny died, he'd been in recovery for 1.5 years. He was a chef in one of Edmonton's best restaurants. He lived in his own apartment downtown. What worked for Danny was opioid agonist treatment with methadone, combined with counseling, the counseling we paid for privately. What did not work was the fact that both he and we wanted him drug-free, and he did not stay on the methadone long enough to be stable. For a while, it seemed like we had the old Danny back, the kid that we knew before the substance use. On the outside, he seemed like a successful young man, but he was struggling. His addiction started as a way of dealing with severe social anxiety. Just like Rachel said this morning, there are always underlying issues. But there are other risk factors. A learning disability, being gay, working in an environment where drug use is prevalent, being impulsive, and being risk-seeking. He told me once that when he took the drug, he could walk into any room and just be himself. And I wondered, should it be so difficult for a young person to be himself? Should we not offer mental health supports that allow them to be themselves without turning to drugs? What I've learned since that the single greatest barrier to providing good supports is stigma. Society sees drug use as an self-inflicted problem, and they see overdose as a form of evolution. People don't understand that everybody who uses and all those who die are someone's brother, sister, mother, father. They're somebody, someone. Lesson 2, know the risk factors. A significant risk factor is not only the drug, but also the route of consumption, how you take it. The longer the person is involved in substance use without getting help, the greater the risk. And Danny had progressed to injection drug use, which carries the highest risk. We learned a lot since he died, and the biggest missing piece was harm reduction. And it was, for the longest time, the best kept secret. So much of what is done in this country and other countries is not based on evidence, is based on societal norm and on morals. In Canada, this is slowly changing, but people are dying faster than the harm reduction and the evidence treatment approaches can be brought online. All too often, the focus on information given to parents and users is to get clean. Another term I don't care for much. People do relapse, and we did not learn about potential life-saving solutions such as naloxone until it was too late. Lesson 3, we love you, be safe, carry naloxone. Naloxone is a safe medication that can reverse an opioid overdose. If administered in time, Danny was as safety conscious as he could be doing something very dangerous. He always bought fresh needles, but on the night when he died, he was home alone, so there was nobody there who could have saved him when he overdosed. I can't tell you how many times, and I have to reach down to my prop here, how many times I've imagined carrying my naloxone kit that I now keep in my purse with him and taking the right steps to save him. Before his death, I had never heard of naloxone. Anybody who takes drugs from the illicit market, or even anybody who's on prescription opioids, should have a naloxone kit on hand and make sure their family and friends know how to use it. Evidence shows that if we distribute one naloxone kit per 1,000 people, we can cut overdose death in half. In Alberta, we have some of the widest distribution in the country, but we still have big gaps, especially in rural and First Nations community and in jails. Ideally, you should never use drugs alone, but if you do, make sure you tell somebody, and don't use drugs somewhere where you can't be found, such as bathrooms in a mall or in a stairwell. Many moms I know have lost their kids in those places. Lesson 4, know what an overdose looks like, know how to respond. These rules are like basic first aid and more important since the arrival of toxic drugs such as fentanyl and carfentanil. Before fentanyl, the people most at risk were people like Danny who were injection drug users and were dependent. But now, casual users are also at great risk as contamination with fentanyl is found in drugs that should not contain an opioid, such as cocaine and ecstasy. Contrary to public belief, not everybody who uses substances is addicted. Many of us use substances without ever becoming dependent. I had a glass of wine last night to calm my nerves for today's presentation. I'll be fine tonight if I don't have a glass of wine. Using substances is as old as the human race, and some people will always use. Nancy Reagan's message of just say no, which is echoed by the current president, has proven to be a total failure. What young people need today is smart and factual information, and often they know more about drugs than the teachers who educate them. People need to not only know about the dangers of drugs, but also how to stay safe, just like we teach safe sex and drinking and driving. Lesson 5, don't run, call 911. I know several mothers whose children would be alive today if their friends would have called help when they overdosed. In too many cases, people do not seek the help they need because of fear or persecution. Earlier this year, Canadian Parliament passed the 911 Good Samaritan Overdose Act, which protects people from possession charges if there is an overdose emergency situation. The law is intended to enable people to call for help without repercussions. This is a tiny but important step in the direction towards decriminalization. But there are still huge issues with people knowing about the law and law enforcement knowing how to interpret it correctly. We need to focus on saving lives and helping people and not locking them up. My next message is support, don't punish. As a society, we need a paradigm shift away from substance use as a criminal justice problem to approaching it as a health and human rights issue. Our Mothers Group calls for the decriminalization of personal use of illegal drugs. And while this is a big shift for Canadian society, decriminalizing possession has been shown to save lives and reduce crime in several European countries. Marlis talked about that this morning. She also talked about the importance of good regulation. Since decriminalization, Portugal has less drug use, fewer people arrested, fewer people incarcerated, more treatment, less HIV/AIDS, and most importantly, fewer drug deaths. How can we expect people to get help for something that could give them a life-altering criminal record? Locking people up for using drugs causes tremendous harm to the individuals, to their families, and their community, while doing nothing to help these people and nothing to curb the supply of drugs. My next message is drug policy causes more harm than bad drugs. Let that sink in. Bad drug policy causes harm. This young woman is Brycey. She was in recovery, no longer used, when she died earlier this year in one of the prairie provinces. She did not die from an overdose, but from heart disease. The infections caused by dirty needles she shared and repeatedly used damaged her heart, kidney, and liver. Brycey did not have access to a needle exchange, and the city where she lived still does not plan for any supervised injection sites. If Brycey would have had access to both, she would not have died. Our prohibitive policy, based on the false assumption that needle exchanges and supervised consumption sites condone drugs, cause incredible harm, and Brycey's cause of death should read bad drug policy. The picture on the right is an Oxy Neo. When it became clear that we were duped by Purdue Pharma regarding their claims of non-addictive properties of OxyContin, and when people all over North America became dependent on the drug either by prescription or the illicit market, OxyContin was reformulated into a tamper-proof version and rebranded Oxy Neo, which, by the way, also extended their patent and made them more money. Users were left stranded. Nobody thought to combine measures to curb the supply with measures that affect demand. When you are dependent on opioids, you don't just stop taking them because your supply has changed. Criminal gangs quickly filled the void with drugs that are easy to smuggle and sold at a huge profit. Bad drug policy brought us fentanyl and other synthetic drugs. Because of the potency of fentanyl and because it sold, the strengths it sold in vary so greatly, and as well in the quality, overdoses have increased enormously in Canada and the US. In many regions, including Alberta, more people die from fentanyl than traffic collisions. Bad drug policy has been the cause of death of thousands. Danny's substance use started with Oxy. It ended with a fatal overdose of fentanyl. Oh, sorry, this was Brycey. This is, okay. Lesson 8, we need to redefine recovery. People who recover from substance use, people can recover from substance use if we use evidence-based, proven treatment approaches with harm reduction measures to keep them alive. Some people simply outgrow dependence when they mature, life circumstances change. Our expectations of recovery have to change. These photos are from the Salome project in Vancouver, where people who have otherwise failed in treatment approaches have access to injectable hydromorphone. The results have been amazing, and the stabilizing effect in people's lives are incredible. Without having to seek the illegal fix, people have housing, work, they reconnect with their loved ones, and they have hope for the future. People I know take a daily dose of methadone or Suboxone, and you would never know. It's part of the health regime, just like some of you may take blood pressure medication or insulin. Recovery does not have to mean drug-free. Recovery means being free from the chase of the substance you buy on the street. For some people, it may be drug-free, but making clean the benchmark has cost the lives of so many, and it's an unrealistic goal. These are the people that inspire the work of Moms Stop the Harm. These are just some of the children of the mothers and children, brothers, sisters, husbands of the people in our group. By telling these people's stories, we hope to bring about change and end the stigma and change drug policy, in hope that we can keep others alive so they have a chance for another day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. All right. So we have one more to take us a global perspective, I think. We were really excited to reach out to Phelim Kine, who's the Deputy Director at Asia Division at Human Rights Watch, because we wanted to bring a bit of perspective to this from a larger kind of global perspective as well. We've been talking local. So Phelim has been a journalist for more than a decade. He's in China, Indonesia, Cambodia, Taiwan. You can see his bio on page 3, but I'm not going to delay us any longer. But he's going to speak to us, Human Rights at the Edge of Darkness. We are the resistance. I really like that. Okay. And I need to get your PowerPoint right there, right?
Where is that? Right here, right?
There you go.
Okay. May I? Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's I got to say it's always very moving to be in venues like this when I get a chance to meet with people who are really at the coalface and the front lines of this battle for human rights at the local level, and listening to Cam talk about the issue of institutionalized racism against our First Nations people and the absolute corrosive cross-generational impact that has, to listen to Petra and bring this incredibly tragic but also empowering dialogue about the impact of the war on drugs as it's waged both here in Canada and the United States and globally. I want to maybe bring some more context to this, but first I just want to say it's great to be in Edmonton. I'm going to age profile myself and let you know the last time I was in Edmonton, Brian Mulroney was the Prime Minister of Canada. Ronald Reagan was the President of the United States, and I was making a gainful living as an industrial tree planter outside Whitecourt. So I think the fact of, yes, you too, saw you there. I think the fact that if we can survive those things, it's a testament to progress, okay? But that's sort of the humor part of this presentation, because frankly, we're at a kind of a scary point in terms of the global human rights movement. As Cam and Petra mentioned, things have never been easy for Indigenous peoples and for First Nations peoples and peoples of color. And the drug issue and the war on drugs has always been a complete waste of life and time and resources. But what's happening now is that established universal human rights principles are being questioned, scorned, undermined by governments of countries that have long been supporters and even standard bearers of universal human rights. And of course, universal human rights are established principles that are designed to protect people from the abuses and neglect of their governments. And so this is a dangerous time, and the future, and it's a threat to the future. It's a threat to my future, your future, our future. You know, we are in this together, and that's why this event with the John Humphrey Center here is so important, because it brings us together. And when I walked in and I saw those words, I saw the words and the principles of security, freedom, justice, and dignity. These are the things that we are fighting for. And just like oxygen, we don't notice them generally until there's an absence. And that's what we're fighting against now. And it's particularly important that we fight for these principles, because the road to establishing human rights principles has been very long and very torturous. They started back in the 17th century with philosophers like John Locke and Thomas Paine, who talked about the idea of natural rights. And natural rights had three components: life, liberty, and property. The problem with that is property back then included what? Any ideas? Women and slaves, okay? Exactly. Slavery. And of course, in the United States today, we see, similar to the legacy of the racist policies against First Nations people in Canada, the absolute corrosive cross-generational impacts of racism, of post-slavery Jim Crow laws that still and are continuing to haunt the United States. So the origin of this, you go forward 200 years, it's not until 1940, January 1940, then US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the depths of World War II, came up with what he felt was an antidote to what he saw as this existential battle between human freedom and human slavery. And he came up with a concept that was revolutionary, the idea of universal human rights that applied to everyone through our common humanity. And he called this the 4 freedoms, 4 ideas. There were 2 freedoms of something and 2 freedoms from something. Anybody know freedom of 1940? Freedom of, what's a really important? Freedom of expression, right here in the front row. Keep going. Freedom of, what's important? What do some people do on Sundays? Freedom of religion, freedom of worship. Freedom from something. What do you want to be free from? Freedom from fear. And freedom from a concept that is still revolutionary, at least in the United States. Freedom from want. That means economic security, the right to health, the right to education. And these ideas, the 4 freedoms, didn't really go anywhere, but they planted the seed in the mind of his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the real driver. And what she did is she pushed, pulled, and dragged the newly formed United Nations to take those ideas, to deepen them and widen them into something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There she is. Why is that important? 1948, it's the end of the war. And there is a consensus amongst this war-weary organization of member states that measures need to be taken to inoculate humanity from the abuses and the outrages of World War II. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 articles, freedom froms, freedom ofs, and it was extraordinary because they're inexplicably linked to inalienable rights based on our common humanity, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of creed. And this document was a great document, but it kind of went nowhere because it is aspirational. It's not a treaty. It's not international law, but it provided the seedbed for what is the international human rights movement. And this international human rights movement, starting in the late 40s, was implicitly and explicitly designed to address what had happened from 1939 to 1945. It was essentially based on an ethos of never again. And so from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have this architecture of human rights law that's called, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. We have this architecture of a United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In Geneva, we have a Human Rights Council that meets and discusses and debates on human rights issues. We have had, over the decades, the development of a series of treaty status covenants that address the issues of some of the world's most marginalized, vulnerable communities. Covenants to protect children, the rights of women, the rights of refugees. All of these things, at the very least, have served as strong symbolic inspirational value for oppressed peoples around the world, including South Africans under apartheid, including Taiwanese and Indonesian peoples under their respective dictators. And now for Chinese human rights lawyers who are fighting to get their rights under an oppressive authoritarian regime. But the fact is that this ethos and this objective of never again clearly failed when you look at the historical record. It didn't help the estimated 1 million Indonesians who were killed by their government as a part of a quote-unquote anti-communist drive. It didn't help from 75 to 79 the estimated 1.7 million Cambodians who died under the Khmer Rouge. And it didn't help the estimated 800,000 Rwandans who died in 1994. So the good thing, if you can take it from this, has been a learning that the human rights movement at the very least is evolutionary. And what has happened is people have learned from these mistakes, and has been a development, an ongoing development of mechanisms for an idea that we call accountability. Accountability to ensure that the people and the institutions and the agencies that commit these types of atrocities will be held to account. So we've gone from never again to an idea of, if you do this, someday you will pay. And so we've had the development of things like, for example, the idea of universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is a concept that allows any local court to prosecute someone implicated in war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, no matter where it's happened. You can prosecute them. In Edmonton, under universal jurisdiction, police can arrest and prosecute someone for crimes against humanity in Indonesia or in Rwanda. That's one piece of progress, piecemeal, but still. We also have had the development and the launch of the International Criminal Court, which is dedicated to bringing to justice leaders of governments who are implicated in mass killings of their people. And we also have this concept that was known as responsibility to protect, or the UN, they call it R2P, which obligates member states of the UN to intervene in countries where there is evidence of genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity, as long as there's Security Council approval. Now, these things don't always work as smoothly as you'd like. R2P was the basis for the intervention in Libya, and we've seen what's happened in Libya since then. But at the very least, I take some satisfaction in knowing that things like your universal jurisdiction keeps suspected, implicated war criminals like Henry Kissinger away from places like France, where he could be arrested and prosecuted for his alleged crimes. Now, this transition from, So we've gone from this idea of accountability, and the 1990s was really the high watermark for this idea of accountability, of really where the rubber met the road in terms of trying to ensure that if people did abuse the rights of their people, that they would pay. Now, the 1990s, after '89, it was this period of relatively brief but intense exuberance. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union imploded, and there really was this idea that maybe there could be a new world order in which human rights really were a meaningful part of the conversation, rather than just marginalized by Cold War realpolitik. And this was the period that was really, the optimism was summarized in Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, who in 1992 predicted and stated confidently that there was a victory of Western liberal democracy and things were going to be just fine from here on in. I think the confidence or overconfidence of that era can be summarized or symbolized by then President Bill Clinton's internationally televised press conference with then Chinese Premier Jiang Zemin, in which Bill Clinton looked across at him and said, "Sir, you are on the wrong side of history. Your authoritarian system, you're going to go under." And I think that we see instead that That has not happened. But the other part of the 90s is that there's also been, it was the critical mass of the international human rights non-governmental sector, organizations like my employer, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Global Witness, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, organizations that explicitly and purposefully sought to supplement the United Nations' very under-resourced investigative functions with regards to human rights abuses by sending individuals out to areas where there were suspected human rights abuses, scrupulously documenting and verifying them, and then publicizing them in an effort to get international or national pressure to bring about change. This was the period that I like to refer to as the name and shame period in terms of the international human rights movement. And you know what? It worked for a while. I think it's fair to say that the 2+ decades that the then captive of the Burmese regime, Aung San Suu Kyi, she probably would have been killed if there hadn't been such high pressure, high voltage scrutiny by the international community that was fueled by the international human rights movement. I personally have witnessed how Chinese political prisoners during that period were released, or at the very least, the abuses against them diminished somewhat because of international scrutiny. But that high watermark kind of evaporated, went down in flames on 9/11, September 11th, 2001. And that's when and because the administration of George W. Bush, the self-inflicted wounds of the war on terror. Number one, allowing the torture of terrorism suspects. And number two, allowing the indefinite detention without trial of terrorism suspects at Guantanamo. This threw under the bus, trashed key concepts of contravention and the banning of torture internationally, and concepts of due legal process that are built into international law and domestic law. And this has had corrosive long-term impact. First in the international sphere, where I personally have sat across from diplomats representing abusive authoritarian regimes who have thrown back at me my well-documented instances of abuses by their government by saying, you people, as in you Westerners, you white people, you Americans, you torture. You have no skin in this game anymore. It's been exploited by those people and given them this excuse of a moral equivalency. And the other thing is, domestically in the United States, here we are 16 years later, and last year there was a very compelling survey of the American public about the tolerance or approval of torture. The percentage of Americans who think that torture is absolutely unacceptable. Any guesses? Percentage of Americans? I'll accept any guess. Any guesses? Yeah? 95% who think it's never permissible. Thank you for that. It's much lower. Anybody else? Is that 20? Anybody else? Huh? 15 is correct. Maybe you said 50. Only 15% of Americans think that it is never okay to torture people. That's despite the fact that it's against US law and it's against international law. 63% of Americans think it's okay to torture in lots of instances. So that is where we're at. The second thing that's been the challenge to the international human rights movement is the rise of China. And the rise of China as an economic, diplomatic powerhouse that is premised explicitly and implicitly on a subordination or denial or abuse of what we see as what are universal civil and political rights: freedom of association, freedom of worship, free media, in exchange for, or for the excuse of what they refer to as rights of subsistence and development, more of an economic rights perspective. Now, this has been problematic because China's success and growing diplomatic heft has made it, implicitly or explicitly, a model for developing countries, particularly in Africa, where China is investing heavily in infrastructure, in foreign aid. I'm not against infrastructure development, I'm not against foreign aid, but it's problematic when it is premised on this idea that it's okay for states to say, freedom of association, freedom of expression, that these rights can wait until we are all at a certain level of development sometime in the future. Because all indications are in China, that will be a very, very, very long time away indeed. So where does that put us? Right now, we're in this period where human rights are increasingly, the utility, the effectiveness, the logic, the applicability of human rights are being questioned by a new generation of populist leaders who are peddling a ugly, insular, nativist strain of politics that boils down the answers to complex questions to blaming certain groups it deems as outsiders. Problems like that are related to globalization, economic inequality, technological change, terrorism, and the worst refugee crisis in a generation. You know these people. We know them, we see them. People like Donald J. Trump of the United States, Viktor Orban of Hungary. And even though Marine Le Pen lost the election, she still has a very popular constituency in France. These are people who identify certain groups as the enemy of the state. For Viktor Orban, who's building a wall against refugees coming from the Middle East, it's refugees. For Marine Le Pen, it's the sons and daughters of immigrants. For Donald J. Trump, it's people from south of the border who he refers to as bad hombres. Now, why is this problematic? Well, we know from 2 weeks ago in Charlottesville that these types of ideas are starting to get currency, that they appeal to a certain constituency of the population in the United States. And this appeal was identified and warned of by Hannah Arendt, who wrote the classic book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And Hannah Arendt warned that in the future, I'm quoting, one fine day when we have decided that a population segment is no longer good or right or useful, that society will conclude quite democratically that for humanity as a whole, it would be better to liquidate parts of it. Well, unfortunately, that's already happening in a place called the Philippines, and particularly under an individual. I think I need my friend from, where's my friend from IT? Is my IT friend here? Slide. I'm trying to get my slide. The slide? I'm trying to get the YouTube. Yeah, I can't find it. There it is. Okay, great. Thank you. Gotcha. So this is already happening in the Philippines under a guy by the name of President Rodrigo Duterte, who was elected democratically on a political campaign that was specifically and unabashedly designed and offering to provide mass killings of suspected drug users and drug dealers as a form of crime control. And he's delivered on those promises with a vengeance. This is President Duterte.
My campaign against drug will not stop until the last pusher and the last drug lord are...
He means what he says. In 13 months, President Duterte's police force has killed upwards of 12,000 people, okay? The vast majority have been killed, extrajudicial killings by the Philippines National Police or people who are working for the Philippines National Police. And he talks about killing drug lords, but if you take a look at the profile of his victims, the vast majority of those people are some of the poorest, most marginalized, most vulnerable people of the Philippines. This is more of a war on the poor. Now, I'd like to tell you that Filipinos have risen up in revulsion at this, but you know what? He's got 70 to 80% popularity polls. There is a segment of the Philippine society that is willing to throw urban slum dwellers under the bus in exchange for some sense of security. The Philippines is exhibit A of how badly, how quickly, how dangerously a democratic society can go off the rails when you add the corrosive elements of social fear and unrest and a populist demagogue. Now, I'd like to tell you also that in Asia generally, neighboring states are reacting with alarm to this killing campaign, but it's actually the opposite. In Indonesia, right next door to the Philippines, senior police officials and senior government officials have for the past year been saying what a good idea it would be to apply the same metrics of this war on drugs to Indonesia. The president of Indonesia last month said, quote unquote, for police, if they encounter drug traffickers, quote unquote, shoot them down, show no mercy. The police are listening. Last week, the Jakarta police chief, on the record, said that the job of his police officers was to send drug traffickers to heaven, not to arrest them. This gives you an insight into what Petra was talking about in terms of the local context of drug wars, how dangerous they are, and how they victimize communities who are already severely vulnerable. Last night, President Donald J. Trump talked about his new Afghanistan strategy. Well, Afghanistan, over the past 16 years, the United States has pumped in about $1 trillion. Huge amounts of blood and treasure that have been pumped in by other nations, including Canada's. And what we see is that really the only beneficiaries of the war of Afghanistan are organized crime syndicates who have been milking the heroin poppy trade and paying insurgents like the Taliban and Islamic State elements in order to get access to the poppy. And this is a country in which every 12 minutes, an Afghan woman dies in childbirth. So vulnerable communities are being left behind in the larger picture. The salient fact is that drug wars are abusive, discriminatory, and the losers are always the most vulnerable and the most marginalized citizens, whether you're talking about Peruvian and Colombian campesinos, whether you're talking about Manila slum dwellers, whether you're talking about First Nations individuals, whether you're talking about people of color in the United States. Every 25 seconds in the United States, a black person or a Latino person is arrested for marijuana possession. And that arrest sends them almost inevitably into a pipeline to prison that they rarely get out of. In Manhattan, New York, where I live, a person of color, a black or Latino, has an 11 times greater likelihood of being arrested for marijuana possession than somebody who looks like me. And white people and people of color basically use drugs the same way. This is racist policing, and it tells you that any government who seeks to arrest or shoot its way out of a drug problem doesn't understand a drug problem. The problem of illegal drugs is a public health problem. It's a socioeconomic problem. You do not shoot your way or arrest your way out of it. No government can logically or morally argue for this approach anymore. Now, where do we go from here? That brings us to us here today. Moving forward, I said that when I saw those words, security, freedom, dignity, and justice, they're not just words, and they're concepts that require support, defense, and what I'm asking us to do and you to do and what this organization and what this meeting should do should result in an explicit recognition and pressure for and pressure on our elected representatives to reaffirm the support and defense of universal human rights as an essential firewall against barbarism, okay? Both at home and abroad, we need to be true to these values. When I say these values, these universal values, let's not call them Canadian values or American. These are universal values that are our birthright as humans. And one thing that we can do, you've already done it, you're here. For whatever reason, you're part of this. And making this happen requires and depends on community, and I mean real community. It can start at the internet level, but we need face-to-face interactions. And other things that we can do are to support and subscribe to fact-based journalism that are really the essential bulwark against the abuses of creeping authoritarian or creeping autocrats that are emerging across the world. I think the thing that I want to end with is by introducing you to somebody who has long been an inspiration for me and really puts some kind of context in terms of what we want to do here today. I'm sorry, I think I need my assistance here. Yeah. Minimize. There we go, great, thank you. How do I get that? Oh, okay, great. Okay, so I want to end with introducing you to this person. This person is this is a man by the name of Bassel Kalabil, and he was a 20-something Syrian from a Palestinian family who had a great software job in the old Syria, was engaged to be married, and when Syrian society and the country fell apart as elements rose up against the authoritarian Bashir al-Assad, he had the choice of leaving the country, joining waves of refugees with his fiancée and creating a new life somewhere, maybe here in Canada, maybe here in Edmonton. And he chose not to. He chose to stay at home. And he chose to work with human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, to document the crimes that were occurring and to provide on-the-ground witness in the hopes that it would contribute to future accountability and to a better Syria after the war. And in the last 3 weeks, it's been revealed that Bassel was killed, executed after a secret trial in a secret prison in 2015. Now, the message I want to leave you with is that human rights are never a winning cause, never. But they're not a lost cause. They're an ongoing cause. They require defense, support, work. It's like marriage, okay? And it's up to us to really put our hands to the wheel, at the very least in recognition of the sacrifices of people like Bassel and so many others that I have met personally in places like Cambodia and China and Indonesia. It's not easy, and it's up to you, me, us. We are the resistance, and human rights are the only firewall against barbarism that we have. Thank you very much for listening.